I'd just like to pay tribute to Liz. She's far too modest to mention it, but she was the chair of the Holiday Society until last year, and she's been really responsible for the reinvigoration of this society. So I think everybody in this room knows her a great debt. I'd also like to start by thanking the organisers of this conference. A huge amount of organisation and work has gone into it. And I think it's going to be a fascinating and really inspiring couple of days. And I'm really, really honoured to be here chairing this panel of amazing women, whom I'm going to introduce shortly. And then they'll each be speaking, and then we'll have some time, hopefully, for questions at the end. So, first of all, Frances Weber, who probably needs no introduction because she's Young Women's President. But she's a very well-known barrister who for many years fought for the rights of migrant women and for refugee women. And she has written a book which I can recommend to everyone called Borderline Justice, The Fight for Refugee and Migrant Rights. It's really worth reading because it really gives a great overview of the whole subject. She's also associated with the IRR and teaches at Birkbeck occasionally. She's going to give us an overview first of the whole subject of women, migrant women, and also talk about refugee women. And then sitting right at the end here is Dr. Dorys Quintana Cruz from Havana University. We're very honoured that she's come here. She's the Professor of International Public Law at the University of Havana, and is responsible for international relations for the Cuban National Union of Jurists and was a diplomat for over 40 years. And she's the co-author of the Public International Law textbook that's used in Cuban universities. And she's going to speak to us about gender, armed conflict, and migration. Now, Dorys is going to speak to us in English, but she may need help from an interpreter at some stages, and particularly with the questions afterwards. Then on my right, we have Marina Prentoulis from the University of East Anglia, where she's a senior lecturer in media and politics. She is the winner of the Contemporary Political Theory Annual Prize for 2013, and is an expert on political communications, contemporary social movements, European radical ideologies, and discourse analysis. And as Liz mentioned, she has been a spokesman for Syriza, but she's asked me to say she's not speaking in that capacity today. She's not speaking for Syriza today. She's going to talk about the refugee crisis and austerity as it affects migrant women. And finally, to my left here, Dr. Rayah Feldman, who again will be known to many of you as the co-founder and chair of Hackney Migrant Centre. And she's a researcher and activist on migrants' rights, but now works with the charity Maternity Action, where she researches the experience of women asylum seekers dispersed during pregnancy. And she's going to talk to us particularly about the whole issue of refugee women's access to maternity care, which is becoming increasingly a problem. So a really exciting lineup of speakers for our first session, and I'd like to start by asking Frances Weber to speak.
Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, Liz, and thanks for inviting me. It's a great honour to be asked to speak. And it's not so much an overview, well, it's a sort of an overview of what's happening in the UK. So I think much of it applies also to other European countries and other sort of host countries where migrants and refugees try to seek a life for themselves. So, bombing Syria, the argument that Liz was mentioning about we have to bomb Syria because of what ISIS is doing to women is actually, it's absolutely typical of a dishonest misappropriation of women's rights by politicians for their own completely other purposes. And another example of that we saw in Home Secretary Theresa May's conference speech in October, where she complained that the asylum system did not protect vulnerable people, didn't protect women, protected people who were going to exploit the system. The strongest, the wealthiest and the luckiest were the ones who could come to the UK to claim asylum. So her solution was not to dismantle the barriers that have been put up over the past 3 decades by the governments of the UK and the EU, which have prevented refugees from seeking safety legally, the visa controls, the carrier penalties. It's those things, it's the combination of those policies which make it impossible for refugees to get on airplanes like the rest of us do, or to get on ferries. You know, we think nothing of travelling the world for a wedding or whatever. Nobody stops to ask, why can't refugees just get on a plane or whatever? And it's because of European policies over the past 30 years, which have imposed visas on nationals of refugee-producing countries, which have imposed carrier sanctions to make it, to fine airlines and shipping companies which bring people in without visas, with no exemptions if they are carrying refugees, if they are carrying people from war-torn countries. Combined with policies of criminalisation, which have seen Rob Laurie, I don't know if you've heard of Rob Laurie's case, who found in France a 4-year-old girl who needed to be brought to the UK to join her family. So he puts her in his van and he gets arrested and convicted. I'm not sure what's happening at the moment, but he's being charged, you know, with migrant smuggling. You can go to prison for it. So you've got those policies of criminalisation of solidarity. All of those policies. So Theresa May has the cheek to say these policies, the system, she doesn't say these policies, our asylum system rewards the wealthiest, the luckiest and the strongest, without explaining that actually it's her policies which have done this. She talks in a way, she's right to say that the system penalises the vulnerable. That doesn't mean that the vulnerable don't come. And the whole point of her conference speech was, as I say, she wasn't saying, so we're going to make it easier for people to come legally. It was to say, so if people try to come on their own, as it were, to come to the UK illegally and to claim asylum once they're here, they won't have as many rights as people that we select from the refugee camps. So it was using that situation in order to narrow, in order to restrict asylum rights. So yes, it's a scandal that the system penalises the vulnerable, but it's the European politicians that have created that system. And she talked about manipulation. She said that the system is geared towards helping those who are most able to access it and who manipulate it for their own ends. And again, we see the same kind of language, the language of suspicion, of entrenched hostility towards migrants and refugees. And it's the same mindset that we see now towards migrants and refugees that we saw in the 70s when the scandal of virginity testing was exposed. And that was women coming to join fiancés from the Indian subcontinent who, in the 1970s, who were being subjected to vaginal examination in British High Commissions in India and Pakistan, and sometimes at Heathrow. And the reasoning behind the tests was as follows. One, the arrival of South Asian women to join their husbands was being strictly rationed. So there was a 2-year queue. Women who were married to South Asian men who were settled in the UK had to wait for up to 2 years to get entry certificates. They were entitled to come to join their husbands, but they had to wait for up to 2 years to get entry clearance. At the same time, the British government decided they didn't want all these unattached South Asian men in the UK, the ones who were not married. They didn't want them being available and possibly molesting and possibly marrying white women. So they wanted them to be able to bring in their fiancés. They knew, or they believed, that South Asian girls who were unmarried would be virgins. They suspected that wives would manipulate the system to try to jump the queue and pretend to be fiancés. And so the logic, this kind of colonial logic, built totally on racist attitudes, racist and sexist attitudes. It made perfect sense in the colonial logic. So we will subject these women to vaginal examination to make sure that they are actually fiancés and not wives. So that was the solution, rather than simply speeding up the visas for wives. So we see exactly the same kind of logic at work with the policies of deterrence and hostility, which apply, of course, to all migrants from the global south and refugees, not just women, but as Liz said in her introduction, the problems that confront migrants and refugees in the journey to Europe are compounded. We know that something like 3,500 people have drowned in the Mediterranean so far this year. So these journeys are incredibly dangerous and terrifying. And we know that the physical perils of the journey for women are compounded by the difficulties and problems that women face as women, from menstruation pregnancy, childbirth, through to the pervasive risk of sexual assault, to the primary responsibility for care of children. And it's the same when people arrive, that the system means you might be dispersed into a slum hostel where 23 women and children share one bathroom in a hostel run by a security multinational G4S. There have been reports about mothers and babies and toddlers being moved into houses infested with cockroaches, rats, etc. And being forced to live on about £36 per week for everything. In 2002, an HIV positive new mother, who was obviously under medical instructions not to breastfeed her baby, was forced to go to the High Court to get the Home Office to pay for formula milk because they wouldn't pay for it. She simply couldn't afford it. So she was either going to have to breastfeed and basically infect her child, or God knows what. That's the kind of culture of enforced destitution. So women face that, or they face detention in Yarl's Wood, which is notorious for the levels of self-harm, medical neglect, repeated allegations of sexual harassment, inappropriate use of force. Male staff carrying out health screening, asking intimate questions, male staff watching over sleeping women, entering women's rooms without knocking. Women are driven mad by detention. There was a woman in Yarl's Wood. She was in there for 17 months. She came to the UK to join her refugee husband. She didn't understand some of the questions she was asked at the airports. She was taken into detention, and she was there for 17 months. As she got more and more distressed, not understanding what on earth was going on, why she was being detained, why she was being separated from her husband, she started to self-harm. The response to that self-harm was isolation. She was put in isolation cells. And so this dreadful vicious circle of worsening mental health, more and more distress, staff saying, you're just manipulating. So those are the sort of problems. I want to move on. I know I'm going to run out of time any minute now, and I've hardly started. There's an entrenched disbelief of asylum claims, which means allegations of sexual violence are routinely disbelieved. There's this idea that when you claim asylum, you've got to be able to explain clearly, succinctly, and promptly everything that's happened to you. It's known, I mean, it's well established since, well, for 2 decades it's been well established that if you have suffered sexual violence, you feel such stigma and such shame that it's impossible to talk about it except in a therapeutic environment. Being interviewed by a Home Office official is not a therapeutic environment. And so a lot of women, of course, cannot speak about these things and are then told when they finally can speak, when they have accessed therapeutic a setting where they can talk about it, then they're told, well, we don't believe you because you didn't mention it when you first arrived. If they are believed, they're told it's a random incident, it won't happen again, and therefore you can go back to wherever you came from. We I was lucky to be involved in some cases which advanced the recognition of refugee claims for women based on domestic violence in 1998 in the Shah and Islam case, and in 2006 the fear of genital cutting as a ground for refugee status. And it was tremendous to be involved in those cases. But then seeing how, after we won those cases, in the teeth of opposition from the Home Office, how the Home Office since then has tried to reverse or to subvert those gains by arguing, well, you might fear what your husband or your family is going to do to you. You can move to somewhere else in the country. This is what they will say, just to get round that. Knowing that in traditional societies, women on their own cannot very often live outside of the network of family. So that's why I'm somewhat cynical when the Home Office launches these, or the government launches these campaigns to great fanfare. You know, we are acting against domestic violence. We are acting against female genital mutilation. We are acting against forced marriage. There's an hidden agenda in there, and it's the same old story of the government misappropriating the language of women's rights for another purpose, for a collateral political purpose. And when you see the way that refuges in this country for women fleeing domestic violence, where the funding has been slashed, and where they are trying to return women to situations of extreme peril in the countries that they come from, then I am extremely cynical of those governments' attempts. Okay, I'm going to end on a positive note. I have to end on a positive note because you look at what's going on in government and you despair. You look at what's going on the ground and you cheer, because there is such a lot of resistance going on, and it's fantastic. And we have to remember that, and we have to add to it. So, it was the work of groups like the South Asian women's group Awaz, which ended the practice of virginity testing, which created a scandal about it. Groups like Southall Black Sisters, the Crossroads Women's Centre, who have been working with, who worked with lawyers at Asylum Aid and the Refugee Legal Centre to form the Refugee Women's Legal Group, which published the first UK legal handbook on women as asylum seekers in 1997. And that was very important because it introduced to the UK ideas about gender-specific forms of persecution and gender-sensitive procedures for women asylum seekers. And it paved the way for recognition of those issues at EU level in the Qualification Directive. So groups like the Jarl's Wood Befrienders and Detention Action, which provide emotional support, material support for women in detention, and literally hundreds of community-based women's groups providing support for those outside. And so, at the borders of Europe, we see women on our TV screens clutching children, protesting, climbing fences, breaking walls, fighting armed guards to save their own and their children's futures. So we owe it to them to be there with them.
you, Francis. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Dorys Quintana Cruz from the University of Havana, who's going to speak to us about gender, armed conflict and migration. We are going to have an interpreter who's going to do translate for Dorys after she speaks.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Good morning to everybody. I wanted to try to talk in English, but I prefer to talk in Spanish because my English is not perfectly, of course. And then I would like to have this interchange with you. This is not a conference, this is not a presentation, this is an interchange between you and us. I want to talk about migration, gender and armed conflict. Este análisis que hemos hecho corresponde al análisis de una situación global que estamos viviendo en la actualidad.
This analysis that we've carried out responds to a global situation that we're currently living through.
Esta situación global es, como todos sabemos, los conflictos armados. En los conflictos armados y las migraciones que, como ustedes saben, en estos momentos también ha cobrado un incremento muy grande. Sabemos todas las situaciones que tenemos con los migrantes en Europa, en América, y no escapamos a esto las mujeres porque esta situación se ha feminizado. ¿Por qué? Porque las mujeres, pues, huyendo de la guerra, huyendo de los desastres naturales, de las situaciones económicas de los países, pues emigran con sus hijos, con su familia, y en el contexto de los conflictos armados en que estamos enfrascados en la humanidad, lamentablemente, según estadísticas de la Cruz Roja, tenemos en el mundo actualmente más de 40 conflictos armados, aunque algunos de ellos no se mencionan, y se mencionan los conflictos más duraderos, como son Palestina, Colombia, los conflictos actuales de Siria, Libia, Colombia, y por tanto queremos hacer un llamado sí.
Well, actually, we'll get this all done. We haven't worked together before. So this situation, this world situation of armed conflict, as we all know, has led to a major increase in migratory movements. And we all know the situations that are well-known situations of migration that affect Europe, that affect the Americas, and we know that also that women are not immune to the process, because the process of migration has become feminized. And why is this? This is because women are fleeing armed conflict, are fleeing natural disasters, are fleeing economic situations. And when they flee these situations, they do so with their children, with their families. And these armed conflicts are affecting the whole of the world, the whole of humanity. According to figures from the Red Cross, there are currently 40 armed conflicts taking place in the world, though some of these, or many of these, are not mentioned by the mainstream media. They only mention the well-known and longer conflicts, such as the Palestinian conflict, or the conflict in Colombia, or the current conflicts in Syria, or Libya, or Colombia, etc. And it's for this reason that we make a call.
Bueno, en este sentido, yo he encontrado en nuestros análisis que la mujer, en cualquiera de las situaciones de los conflictos armados, pues tiene una presencia muy decisiva. Primero les voy a hablar de la mujer como víctima, la mujer como parte vulnerable de la sociedad, es víctima de la guerra. Víctima de la guerra porque ha sufrido durante la guerra abusos sexuales, violaciones, pero además de eso, durante la guerra tiene y mantiene la carga familiar, el cuidado de los niños, de los ancianos, de la familia, y ha sido un blanco de ataque en el papel reproductivo, como hemos visto, por ejemplo, en Palestina, que muchas mujeres embarazadas pues han sido masacradas, matadas, para que no reproduzcan, ya que todos sabemos que esa guerra es fundamentalmente histórica y étnica.
So in this sense, our analysis has shown that in whichever armed conflict we're talking about, women play an absolutely decisive role. And I'm going to speak about three decisive roles that they play. First, women as victims, women as vulnerable members of society, as victims of war, because they've suffered sexual abuse, they've suffered rape, but also because in war, even though there's a war going on, they maintain their family responsibilities. Look after children, look after the old, look after the family as a whole. But they're also targeted specifically for attack. For instance, in the reproductive role that women perform. For example, in Palestine, where we know that pregnant women have been murdered in order to make it impossible for them to perform the reproductive role. Because this is a historical situation that we're living, and it's an ethnic conflict that is taking place there.
Cuando analizamos las estadísticas de la Primera Guerra Mundial, vimos que por cada 20 combatientes moría una mujer. ¿De qué? Epidemia, deterioro, hambruna, víctimas de blancos de la guerra, como civil. Y en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, pues también, que le costó al mundo 50 millones de habitantes, muchas de ellas fueron mujeres que estaban en las concentraciones, que estaban en los lugares, sufrieron muchísimas mujeres israelíes, sufrieron muchísimo los gases, la muerte por los lugares de concentración, con los niños muertas o asesinadas y metidas en las fosas que se han encontrado últimamente, como un horror de esa Segunda Guerra Mundial que marcó un hito histórico en la humanidad.
when we look at the statistics, when we look at the First World War, we see in the First World War that for every 20 combatants, there was one woman died. For every 20 male combatants, one woman was killed as a victim of epidemics, of hunger, and also targeted as civilians. And if we look at World War II, which there were 50 million victims, many of these victims were women. Note in particular the role of the concentration camps, the number of women who killed, Jewish women who were killed and murdered in the concentration camps, and their children murdered as well and were thrown into the mass graves that have been found. Because the horror of World War II was really a historical milestone in the story of victimization of women in armed conflict.
En los conflictos actuales en los que la humanidad está enfrascada, pues hemos encontrado algunas cuestiones que nos horrorizan. Por ejemplo, encontramos que en la guerra de Yugoslavia unas 20.000 mujeres y niñas fueron violadas entre las edades de 7 y 65 años. Nos causó esto una pena muy grande, porque incluso se decía que las mujeres se pintaban con fango, trataban de lucir sucias para no ser violadas. Eso es una victimización, lógicamente, de la mujer en estos conflictos armados. Otra de las situaciones es que cuando han sido violadas, incluso se quedan en estado de preñez, después no se sabe ni quiénes son los padres. Pero además de eso, también engendra enfermedades sexuales transmisoras, como el SIDA, por ejemplo, y la mujer es víctima de esas enfermedades también por causa de los conflictos armados, por causa de ser violada, por causa de ser objeto y sujeto de victimización en los conflictos armados.
And in the current conflicts, we've uncovered horrifying examples. For instance, in the Yugoslavian conflict, the conflict in former Yugoslavia, we know that around 20,000 women and children were raped. Women and children between the ages of 7 and 65 years of age were raped in that conflict. And that has a tremendous effect on us. We learned, for instance, that women would cover themselves in mud or try and make themselves look as dirty as they could as a vain attempt to prevent being raped. And this is an example of the victimization of women. Another aspect is that women may become pregnant as a result of having been raped, and they don't know who the fathers are. And also diseases are transmitted through the sexual contact. So women have become victims of AIDS and other sexually transmitted conditions as a result of conflict and as a result of the rape to which they were subjected as a consequence of the conflict.
Y nosotros como juristas decimos, hay legislaciones internacionales que protegen esta situación, pero ¿qué sucede? Se cumple. Está las 4 convenciones de Ginebra y la cuarta fundamentalmente para la protección de los civiles, los protocolos de Ginebra que también hacen mención a la protección de la mujer, pero decimos, cuando analizamos esta victimización, ¿se cumplen esas legislaciones? No se cumplen, se violan y lo peor es que se cae en la impunidad.
And we, as lawyers, said to ourselves, well, international instruments exist to protect women in these circumstances. But are they implemented? There are the 4, in particular importance of the 4 Geneva Conventions, of which the 4th Convention is the is the most important. It deals with civilian population, and the additional protocols to Geneva as well, that also have measures for the protection of women. But are these international instruments implemented? No, they're not. They're systematically violated, with the result that these crimes reside within impunity.
Otra de las situaciones en que vemos las mujeres en los conflictos armados no es solamente como víctimas. Vemos las mujeres también en la guerra como combatientes. Sin embargo, analicemos una cuestión. A veces las mujeres, y tenemos innumerables ejemplos que por falta de tiempo no podemos mencionar, que han ido y que han participado a través de la historia en diferentes guerras. En la Primera Guerra Mundial, en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, tuvieron un papel muy relevante, pero sin embargo, ¿cuántas mujeres han ascendido después de la guerra o durante la guerra a obtener posiciones dentro de los ejércitos predominantes, generadas, como combatientes, con grados militares superiores? Vemos también que en ese aspecto ha habido cierta discriminación también de la mujer, porque analizábamos en los conflictos, sin embargo, mujeres que combatieron al lado de sus maridos, al lado de sus hermanos, y muy pocas han pasado a la historia como combatientes. Y estamos seguros que ahora en estos momentos en Palestina hay mujeres también que están combatiendo. Hay mujeres también que están combatiendo en Colombia. Sin embargo, han sido o hemos sido también un poco olvidadas o discriminadas y no han ascendido a tener responsabilidades mayores en los ejércitos. En Cuba, por ejemplo, tenemos muchos ejemplos de mujeres que combatieron en la sierra. Sin embargo, nosotros mismos también tenemos mujeres, muchas mujeres coronelas. Y eso que podemos darnos el lujo de exponer cómo en Cuba hemos logrado una igualdad entre la mujer y el hombre, igualdad de posibilidades, igualdad de situaciones, defensa. En estos mismos días celebramos también, como decía la camarada, las actividades en contra de la violación, en contra de la violencia contra las mujeres. Tenemos en el Parlamento que el 43% de mujeres son parlamentarias. Tenemos también que el 65% de mujeres son científicas. Tenemos casi el 70% de mujeres en la actividad jurídica, juezas, fiscales, abogadas. Sin embargo, tenemos una general. Tenemos muchas mujeres coroneles y tenemos una general. En eso también tenemos que ver cómo en la guerra la mujer también ha participado y, sin embargo, hay que reconocerle la participación de la mujer y hay que ascenderlas en la lucha como con grados militares superiores. Nosotros, ya les digo, no nos podemos quejar porque tenemos muchísimas coronelas, muchísimas, pero tenemos una general que está representada en TT Puebla, la generala TT Puebla, y representa en las Fuerzas Armadas la presencia de la mujer en la guerra de la Sierra Maestra. Yo estoy seguro que si en estos momentos, que ojalá no pase, tuviéramos que enfrentar un conflicto, ya la mentalidad, la situación y la protección de la mujer nos llevaría a tener muchas generales. Y en tercer lugar, la situación.
And then there are other situations affecting women in armed conflict. Women, this is the second point, are also combatants. But look at this question. Sometimes women, and there have been many examples over time, women have participated actively in armed conflicts. They played an important role in World War I and World War II. But how many of them were recognised for the role that they played during the war or after the war? How many of them were actually promoted within the forces that they were combating? Here too, there is discrimination. There are many women who fight in armed conflicts alongside their husbands or alongside their brothers, but history has recognised very, very few of those women. I'm sure that there are women fighting in Palestine now. I know that there are women fighting in Colombia now, but they are suffering from discrimination. These women are not recognised within their institutions, and they're not promoted within their institutions. In Cuba, many women fought in the Sierra Maestra during the revolution. And we do have, in Cuba, we have many female colonels in the army. So we can say that we have achieved a degree of equality of opportunity, equal opportunities between men and women. And we celebrate these things, as the comrade mentioned earlier on, the Day Against Violence Against Women, and we celebrate that too in Cuba. And in Cuba, 43% of parliamentarians are women, 65% of scientists are women, 40% of the legal profession are women, judges and prosecutors and lawyers. But despite all of those achievements, we've only got one female general. Many colonels, as I've said, but only one female general. And her existence, she's called Tete Puebla, her existence is a recognition of the role that women played in the Sierra Maestra. But we've still got an awful long way to go, even we in Cuba. Now I'm sure that if it doesn't happen, that if we were embroiled in another conflict, then our understanding of the protection of women and of the role of women would mean that as a result of that conflict we would have many more generals. But let's hope that doesn't happen. And then to go to the third point.
En el tercer y último punto, quiero referirme a los conflictos armados que han traído una consecuencia también muy grave en cuanto a mujeres refugiadas, desplazadas y apátridas.
And in the third and final point, I want to refer to the effects of armed conflicts, a very, very serious impact in terms of women refugees, women migrants and stateless women.
En este sentido, pues también vemos que tenemos legislaciones que protegen a los refugiados, protegen a los desplazados y a los apátridas. Por ejemplo, tenemos la Convención de 1951 de los refugiados, sin embargo, no hace distinción entre mujeres y hombres. Tenemos también que la Convención de Cartagena, el Plan de Acción de Beijing, pues también protege a toda esta situación de esta población, que es una población altísima, según las estadísticas de la CNUD, de mujeres y niñas refugiadas. Se dice que la población total de mujeres y niñas asistidas en el mundo son de 1.117.950 niñas de 0 a 17 años y un total de mujeres de 347.715, lo que da un total de 2.465.665 mujeres y niñas refugiadas, desplazadas, atendidas por la comunidad, fundamentalmente de Asia, de África y de algunos otros lugares del continente del mundo. Y esto es por mencionar algunas cifras que ya en estos momentos y en estos días, que ustedes saben que hay toda una situación con las migraciones de África Norte, Medio Oriente, África Negra, de América Latina, que se están sucediendo y del Caribe, que se están sucediendo en el mundo. Estas cifras, lamentablemente, y digo lamentablemente porque es una situación muy presionante, una situación alarmante, ha aumentado.
And in this area also there is legislation to protect refugees and displaced people and the stateless. We've got the 1951 Refugee Convention, but that makes no distinction between men and women. And there's also the Convention of Cartagena, and the Beijing Plan of Action exists to protect this population. But the figures are alarming. I mean, the UNHCR figures at the moment say that the number of women and children that they are attending to, that there are 1,717,950 children aged between 0 and 16, over 1,300,000 women, to have a total of 2 million, nearly 2.5 million women and children who are currently being attended to. Excuse me, attended to by the UNHCR, and they come. Excuse me. They come fundamentally from Asia and from Africa and some other places in the world. And the figures indicate, well, you all know about the migration crisis of people coming from the refugee crisis, people from North Africa, from the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. Lamentably, these figures, as we all know, are on the increase. We have a serious and an alarming situation of increased migration and refugees.
Y para terminar, les explico que he querido dar esta panorámica muy sucintamente, porque el trabajo recoge una situación más detallada de estas situaciones que nos obligan a solicitar a los movimientos progresistas del mundo, a los abogados que luchamos por la igualdad, a todos los juristas del mundo que luchamos por un mundo mejor, el respeto al derecho internacional público, el respeto al derecho internacional humanitario y el respeto a la dignidad humana. Gracias mil por darme la oportunidad de participar con ustedes en esta linda reunión. Muchas gracias, Jenny, mi presidenta. Gracias, Ginny Mayer, presidenta de la IJD, mi presidenta por mucho tiempo. Y a todas las colegas aquí reunidas, gracias por dejarme levantar mi humilde voz para la defensa de la mujer en cualquier situación que nos encontremos. Muchas gracias.
And to finish, I just want to say that I wanted to give an overview of the situation. We've got a lot more. I have to give a summary of the very detailed information that we have gathered in this research. But I'd like to say finally that I'm obliged, I feel obliged to ask the progressive movement around the world, to ask lawyers who struggle for equality and to build a better world, that you continue with your struggle to ensure that international public law and international humanitarian law are respected, that human dignity is respected. I'd like to end just giving, offering 1,000 thanks to you for inviting me to participate in this beautiful event. Jenny, my president of the ICJ, and to everybody here. Apologies.
The president of International Democratic Lawyers, Jim.
Okay, so you got that one. Apologies for that. For allowing me to speak, to use my humble voice to address you here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dorys, for that inspiring speech. Before I introduce the next speaker, can I just clarify the hashtag for those of you who do Twitter? The wrong one was given previously. The correct one is hashtag WeFightBack15 or 15. So hashtag WeFightBack15. And I'd now like to introduce Dr. Marina Prentoulis, who's going to speak to us about the refugee crisis, austerity, and as both those issues affect migrant women, particularly with reference to the situation in Greece and the refugee crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was using the wrong hashtag all this time. It's your fault. So I'm trying to do some things. If you want to follow, it's at Prentoulis, my last name. So I would like to start with some references on what the last speaker said about Cuba, and why at the beginning when I was introduced I said that I'm not speaking as a Syriza member. Because although Syriza is a leftist party, my experience in relation to gender and left is appalling. The Syriza government has very few women in government. I think it's 7 out of 40 men, 7 women as opposed to 40 men. And of course for the left, especially in Greece, the issue of gender was never an issue. We are still somewhere there. So whenever these issues were brought up, somebody from the left will turn and say, oh, but you know what, this is not priority, we have other priorities. And we go on with this situation. And of course, if there was to Syriza leadership to decide who their spokesperson would be, I'm sure it would have been a man. It's just that I've been doing that for very long, and I have been working for very long with other women activists, which of course they're very rarely recognized. It's not only that, I think it's more than that. It has to do with issues of gender, but also with issues of class, and of course what I want to bring in this talk is also the issue of ethnicity. And what we see today from the side of neoliberal imposition is that we have new articulations of gender, ethnicity and class. I think the same goes if we look at the situation of the European left, where gender and class and the left have to be examined more, because I don't think we are where we should be. If Cuba is not there, I think Greece is much far left behind us. So austerity, I would like to start with austerity and then talk about the refugee crisis. And austerity is female in Greece, and I think austerity is female across Europe. In Greece, with austerity, we've seen a huge increase of unemployment. It's 30% and 60% amongst young people, but of course unemployment among women is much higher. We saw reductions of wages and salaries and the minimum wage, and it's huge, it's about 40%, but again, the reduction to women's salaries is much higher. But there is also another area where we see how austerity in Greece is impacting on women. It's women and care. And as we have the dismantling of the welfare state in Greece, this care, as Louise mentioned, falls back to women. To start with, Greece was never very good in terms of care, provisions for care. So a lot of domestic care had to do with living carers, and which these roles were usually taken by migrant women. So if you have somebody in the family who needs 24-hour care 7 days a week, usually you hire, and this care is not usually offered by the state, you hire somebody which is a migrant woman to stay in the house for very low wages and of course without any insurance. It's all happening on the black market. This progressively is not going to be possible anymore. The families will not have this money in order to hire somebody, and of course the welfare state in Greece, it was bad, now it's even worse. I don't know if there's going to be anything left if we go on like that. So the role of the migrant women has never been recognized. Migrant women will lose, and they're losing their jobs in Greece, but this care, of course, will fall back to the women of the family. In this situation, where you have a state which is totally dismantled and away by austerity, with debt that in Greece is increasing, and when the crisis started it was 120%, and now it has gone to 180%, there is the refugee crisis, which creates an even more terrible situation. Again, gender and ethnicity and how we are responding to this crisis are very important issues. First of all, we should not forget where these women come from and what are the conditions they're living behind, and you mentioned a few things in relation to that. So a lot of women, especially in Syria, they found themselves as being the sole providers. So 1 in 4 refugee families, the women are the sole providers. They have to take the primary responsibility, and they have to do in conditions that they're creating increased anxiety and isolation. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of women that they are trying to escape places of conflict, especially Syria, with no money and with a lot of threats to their safety. So in this environment, refugee women find a new environment which is very unnerving. Not being with a man for a lot of these women, it means something particular. It means losing respect for societies that women usually were seen as always having a man who will be there as the primary provider. Now these women are losing respect. And of course, in many of the countries that these women end up, like Egypt, Jordan, and so on, there are reports of sexual harassment, there are reports about exchanges which have sexual favors involved for shelter and food, and so on. So there is a very difficult situation, a double jeopardy for these women. On the one hand, losing their families in conflict, but on another hand, being in exile and then arriving in countries like Greece or other countries in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, where the environment for them is totally unnerving. The UN Refugee Agency has talked a lot about the conditions that these women face, and especially the conditions they face in Greece. And as I said, we should never forget that austerity, Greece, and the refugee crisis, they are issues that we have to look together. And of course, the reception conditions and the reception capacity in Greece is worsening. The conditions are appalling, and we are faced with a serious crisis. You can see women and children staying in the open, and as women is coming in Greece, these people have to live outside without any safety. The numbers that we are talking about again are quite different than the numbers we are a lot of the Conservatives are using in order to scare us in the UK, for example. So there were 3,000 refugees in Calais. It has doubled after some time to 6,000. But now in Greece we are talking about almost, there are different figures of course in all this, 400,000 refugees that passed the Greek borders in 2015. So we are talking about huge numbers. I find the story of Calais being used for political reasons and being a total disgrace. 3,000, 6,000, 10,000, 20,000 people is nothing. We are talking about millions of people being displaced. A few years ago, one of the responses to the refugee waves in Greece, and a disgrace in itself as well, it was to build a fence in Evros. This is the borders with Greece and Turkey of 20.5 kilometers. This happened in 2012. And this is, because of this fence, how the routes towards Europe through Greece changed, and now the refugees are going through the sea passage. And you mentioned some numbers about how many people have died in the sea, in the Aegean Sea. I'm not sure again if the numbers are correct, because a lot of people, probably much more than the numbers we have gone missing. But in October, in 2 days, 28th to 30th of October, 86 people died in the Aegean Sea near the islands of Lesbos, Rhodes and Kynos. So we are talking about huge numbers. Amnesty International condemns the EU for what is happening, but we have to remember that this, for us, if you look at it from the Greece perspective, is not something new. And it puts questions about the role of the EU in this refugee crisis as well. For us, EU, if it has managed to do anything all this time, is to show lack of political will, lack of taking any responsibility in terms of austerity, in terms of the refugee crisis, and of course lack to offer any vision of what our future will be in this increasingly globalized world, and a world that is increasingly destroyed by conflict. So I believe that we have to connect, when we are thinking of the refugee crisis, to think together austerity, to think again what the European Union wants, to think again what international responses we want. I have to finish, so I will finish with one more thing which I would like you to, I think it's very important when we're thinking gender and ethnicity in Greece. We have to remember that what the neoliberal EU leaders have managed to do across Europe, but in Greece as well, is to give rise to fascists. And in Greece, Golden Dawn, which is a fascist Nazi party, it is now the third biggest party in Greece. The discourse of these fascists is quite well known. They have been against any refugees in Greece. They have actively created gangs that they were killing refugees in the streets of Greece, and at the same time they are the same ones that they are having a totally a discourse which is totally against women. Women should not take the top jobs. Women should return back to their traditional jobs. Imagine now in this environment, and as Golden Dawn, because of austerity, is taking more and more power, what will be the conditions, how hostile and xenophobic the conditions for refugee women will be. So the winter is coming, conditions are getting harder and harder. A lot of women are moving now to meet their partners in Europe, and I think it's now time to demand an international response, both to austerity and the refugee crisis, and bring the issue of gender in this picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Rayah Feldman from the Hackney Migrant Centre, who's going to talk to us about access to maternity care, and she has a PowerPoint presentation. I hope.
Hello everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very flattered. I'm not a lawyer. And so it's a bit scary being in a room full of lawyers. Slight kind of cross wires. My primary allegiance, I suppose, is to Hackney Migrant Centre, which is an organisation I've been very involved with, but I've actually been working for some years with a charity called Maternity Action, and we have done a lot of work on maternity. The organisation as a whole works on maternity rights for women. And a lot of that is about women's employment rights in the UK, but there's always been a focus on migrant women, both in relation to employment rights, but also rights to healthcare, which is the area that I've worked on. And what I really want to talk about today is based on work that I've done trying to look at mainly in the UK, but also looking across Europe at the access that undocumented women migrants have to maternity care. And I really want to address a few particular questions that apply, again, across Europe. Why do we have restrictions on access to healthcare at all for migrants? How has this come about? And what do these restrictions mean for maternity care? In nearly all countries, there are legal barriers to deny or restrict access to health and welfare services for migrants. And I'm using the example of maternity care to explore both the reasons for restriction of access of undocumented migrants, and to look at the impact of restriction, and to hope to open up a discussion on how to challenge these restrictions. Maternity care is an example of barriers to care for undocumented migrants and other migrant women too. But it's also important in its own right because migrant women are liable to have high-risk pregnancies. Many obstetricians regard all pregnancies among migrant women as potentially high risk, both for social and medical reasons. There's particular concern, I think maternity care, of course, maternity is related to fertility. And it does seem to me that in the xenophobic discourse on migration that now characterises the discourse right across Europe, and again, especially in Britain, there's a heady mix both of racism and sexism in a particular focus on pregnant women as sort of being bearers of foreigners. In the consultation that took place 2 years ago, when the government introduced its previous Immigration Act, or it was an immigration bill, in the UK, the only concrete disease, the only group that was mentioned by name, was a reference, entirely unevidenced, that Nigerian women were coming intensively as health tourists to give birth in this country. And I think that this focus on women as bearers of unwanted fertility is actually something that we need to think of in terms of thinking about gender within immigration as a whole. Now, I'm going to just briefly talk about the existing barriers which exist for maternity care for undocumented migrant women, that is, women who don't have authorization to be in the country in which they're residing, or maybe residing in breach of visa conditions. In all countries, barriers limit access to the services which undocumented migrants are entitled to in different ways. For example, administrative barriers, having to give your address when your address is not certain, having to give documentation of your identity when you don't have it, incorrect refusals of care due to lack of awareness by professional staff and administrators, or indeed due to discrimination, lack of knowledge by migrants of their rights and how to access care, and especially fear and indeed the risk of detection of their status and their location through using public services are all major barriers to access. And where general health services are free at the point of delivery, as they are in the UK, financial barriers may be the key barriers which migrant women face. Maternity care, I've already mentioned that migrant women are regarded as particularly vulnerable, particularly liable to high-risk pregnancies, both in terms of social risk factors, which are well known or well discussed among medical professional issues. Social risk factors include issues such as poverty, homelessness or precarious housing, domestic abuse, poor command of language, where you can't navigate your way around the system. These all may be linked also to mental health problems, giving rise to stress and depression. And the effect of many of these factors is to lead women to present very late for maternity care. Women in this situation often have underlying medical complications. The most common are cardiac disease, high blood pressure. Less common but frequent are conditions like HIV and possibly FGM. Pregnant migrant women in Europe experience worse pregnancy outcomes than their peers, and a recent study shows that there's a 45% higher risk of low birth weight and a 24% increased risk of preterm delivery, and a 50% increased risk of perinatal mortality. That's the death of the baby within a week of birth. There's some evidence that the risks are significantly reduced in countries which have better policies to integrate, proper policies to try and reach out to migrant women. And pregnancy is a very important time for intervention, to create the possibilities for midwives to identify and highlight complex needs that, if identified, can be addressed to improve the health of women and their families. And so there are stated and recognised good practice in care of women with high-risk pregnancies, including more frequent antenatal appointments, good history taking, and continuity of care. And all this is much more difficult in the face of the barriers which I've just talked about. What I want to say now is to ask the question, why do migrants, particularly in this context, migrant women, face these kinds of barriers? And why are there so many regulations and restrictions? And I think actually that we need to think about the place of welfare and healthcare, and indeed of civil society, in current migration policies across Europe. And many people have already commented in the sort of published literature and in political discussion of the shift or a kind of movement that to complement the, if you like, the quotes, inadequacy of border controls from the point of view of immigration control. There has been a shift to control migration from inside the border. And many of you who live in the UK will be familiar with the discourse starting not even with this government or the previous government, but with an earlier Labour government, where they talked about creating an uncomfortable environment for migrants. Theresa May has expressed it as creating a more hostile environment. And so you have, I think Francis talked about carrier penalties, but also many welfare restrictions. The whole discussion now around the EU is to do with restricting welfare rights for EU migrants. We have the introduction now in the UK of healthcare charges, not only for the cost of treatment, but you may not know, at 150% of the cost of treatment, like an incentive for the providers to charge. We have landlord checks, driving license checks, restrictions on migrants opening bank accounts. Am I able to do that? Sorry. Okay. But at the same time, there are human rights to do with health that should be universal. And I'll talk very briefly about that, but they are quite limited. Irregular migrants do have the right under the European Convention on Human Rights to emergency care, because it derives from the right to life. But the Convention on the Rights of the Child has in it children's rights to access health services, and in the CEDAW Convention there is actually a clause calling for obliging states to provide appropriate maternity services. But these are not legally very enforceable, and they have to be enforceable within very varied systems of healthcare provision. Now, I did a small study from secondary sources of 40 European countries and their policies on the provision of maternity care. And you would think that given these conventions and given the high risks to women in this situation of adverse pregnancy outcomes, that maternity care would automatically be one of the things that would be provided to all women who present for health care. And actually, it's not the case. And so my classification is a bit rough and ready. It seemed to me that the only country that provides something close to comprehensive healthcare provision, which does include maternity care, is France. There is more limited provision in a number of other countries, in 6 other countries, which does include all maternity care. When I talk about maternity care, I mean care from the antenatal period right through delivery and postnatal. And very interestingly, there are 2 countries, and it may be more because I'm not quite sure how the policies work, Germany and the UK, that actually have very contradictory policies. It would seem that women have free access to maternity care within the health system. But in practice, there are sanctions, immigration sanctions, which undermine the benefits of formal provision. So that in Germany, for example, you are required to, for maternity care, you get something called a Duldur, or toleration, which allows you to stay in the country and receive care if you're an undocumented migrant. But the authority that presents that is obliged to report you to the immigration authorities. In Britain, if you owe more than £1,000 in treatment fees, you are likely to be reported to the Home Office, and no future visa application will be followed. And then, finally, you have five of my 14 countries have no provision for general health care or maternity care, only as a only as an emergency. I was going to give some examples about France and Britain, but I won't. I will reach, because I know that we're running out of time. What I'd like to just draw out is a few implications, and that's the final points I made. It seems to me that the reasons for restrictions on access to healthcare and maternity care are political rather than pragmatic or economic. The Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe has shown that charges for poor people are not cost effective. The cost of postnatal care for newborns with a birth weight or premature babies is much higher. There's little or no evidence of so-called health tourism, of people apparently abusing the provision of public health care. And human rights to health care are very rarely discussed. I think that we need to think how we can challenge these issues. I think we need, as women, to campaign for maternity rights for all. I think that needs to be part of campaigning not only for migrants' rights, but in defence of the health service. I think that we need to think about whether we can use the courts to gain rights for women. Whether it's important to campaign with professionals to try to refuse to implement these kinds of charges. There are many ways of thinking about this.